Hello and welcome to DES 113. This is our last week for our typography class, and I wanted to welcome all those who are watching from home or who have joined me in the live lecture. So, how did we feel week 3 went? Hopefully it wasn't too challenging. Based off of the looks of it, what I've been grading, I thought that there was very minimal amount of feedback that needed to be given. So I think that you all are kind of getting the hang of this design thing. And so it's making me maybe very proud to know that you guys are picking up quick. So let's talk about week 4. We have a lot to cover. There's going to be a little bit of a review. We also have 20 rules of well, I should say 19 rules of typography that we are going to cover today. We're also going to do some housekeeping, some talking about the discussion for week 4, and then we're going to do an assignment demo as well for week 4 in the second half. So I want to thank you for coming. We're going to just dive right in. I wanted to say hello from my office to yours, and I hope that you are having a good day. We are here Tuesday, and we are going to be talking a little bit about the objectives that we're going to be covering today. And so I'll go ahead and close out of this video, but I wanted to give a virtual hello or high five to all those who are sticking with me tonight. And we're going to be talking a little bit about just kind of comparing the quality and the usability in our discussion 4 of free novelty fonts. And so we're going to get into that discussion here in just a little bit, but I wanted to start out with our opener, our slide. And are there any questions with the work that you did during week 3? Anything that you need to know? If not, we'll go ahead and dive right in. So we are going to be talking a little bit about what's going to be expected. Well, we'll talk a lot about what's going to be expected, but I also want to make sure that we are feeling good before we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to talk about our last week, beginning with text. We'll get to this if there's some time, but I wanted to talk about some examples. There's a lot of hand lettering out there, which is really, really neat. A lot of videos to watch. So we might get to that if there's time, but I wanted to just jump right into, we reviewed this based off of week 1, the value of classic fonts. And all throughout this mod, you've been researching fonts, classic fonts, traditional fonts. You've been seeing how fonts work together. How do you pair fonts? So a lot of research, because this is a typography class, a lot of it has been centered around fonts. And so going back to our discussion for font usage and copyrights, there are thousands of fonts available to designers in the field. So to serve yourself and your clients better as you become a good seasoned designer, it's important to understand what you need to look for when purchasing and downloading your new fonts. Because it's all too easy nowadays to go to Font Squirrel or DaFont or any one of those million websites and click on a font and download it instantly. You also want to be sure of copy and usage rights of that font, because even though fonts are readily available by the click of a button, they usually have licensing restrictions. So using a font outside of the licensing restrictions can get you and your client in a lot of legal trouble. You could get sued, and it could impose on copyright fines, and that can be very expensive. So it's gone are the days now where we can just grab what we want to use and on the internet and use it. We need to be able to be aware of the licensing and the copyrights that are out there. So the background of discussion 4 kind of wants you to start researching for fonts online. You're going to get thousands of results, and some that you might have already, that you're already familiar with. Some have to be purchased and established font foundries and software companies. Others are free for personal or commercial use. So it will say if it's free, it usually will say royalty free or free for commercial use. When it says free for commercial use, you can use it for any business, any logo design, anything for a client. If it says free for personal use, you can only use it for your personal projects and not to sell, endorse, or promote product or service. And you cannot, anything that's commercial use, you wouldn't be able to use for clients or other things like that. So anything that promotes something other than your personal projects. But all fonts are not created equal, and we know that. As we've been researching, you know that, right? And nor does every situation call for a sophisticated font family. We just did wedding invitations last week, and before deciding where to look for fonts, you guys kind of already had it in mind what you wanted it to look like. And so discussion 4 takes a better look at fonts and evaluates the project. It considers some of the needs. What does this project need? Is it a project for school or your own practice rather than a professional project? Are you getting paid for this? Is the design for a one-time standalone project, or is it the beginning of a series of work that will need to be expanded on in the future? And so how about the cost and the quantity of the production? All of these questions and considerations need to go into your font decision. Is it an offer on a web banner that will only be posted for a couple of weeks? A packaging label that's going to be reprinted 20,000 copies? Or is it going to be a large, costly wrap for a building? Are you creating a new brand identity, or is this the project part of an already established brand? So you'll need to evaluate the needs. You'll compare the quality and the usability to determine if the cost and quality of a finer font will be worth it, or if it would be cheaper to just use a free version of it. So it'll be your choice. You're the designer, but we'll get into font copyright, licensing, and usage rights. A font, and we already know the definitions, and the discussion will go into what is that. But for this week's discussion, I want you to start with picturing the following scenario. You've been commissioned to create a poster for a music festival. This is a fundraiser for a community garden, okay? Your client has purchased the font family ITC Novaris. Now, I put a link in the discussion for that specific font. They use on all of their branded materials, but they're open for you to use an additional, more unique, or maybe a more decorative font that will work well with the font that was given. But the client does not have a budget to purchase another font. So if you look at the client's font and its copyright restrictions, then you'll need to find a font already on your system that would work, or that you'd want to use on the poster. You'd also make sure that the font you choose works well with the font that your client requires you to use. So again, when you're picking contrasting fonts, you want something that's complementary. You want there to be contrast, right? But you also want it to complement. So once you've determined this font, take a screenshot of it, you embed it in your initial post, and then also I want you to include a link to the font that addresses the following questions. And there's different scenarios here. So that is in and of itself. And I've had some concerns about where to find information about different copy and usage rights. Some students have asked, well, where do you go? Where do you look? But most of them should be listed in the details of each font, EULA. So don't be too concerned if you don't understand it all, or maybe it seems too technical. There are no right or wrong answers here in the discussion. Mostly, I just want to cultivate a discussion on how you would go about finding the information, or and what do you think you'd need to consider? What are some questions you would want to ask your client? The main purpose here in this discussion is to make you aware of that copyrights and usage restrictions do exist, and they need to be considered differently depending on the use, whether they're going to be used for business or for personal use. So for your grading, I'll mainly be looking to see evidence in your writing on that you've done some research on the subject and tried to figure things out, and consider the different circumstances. Even if you didn't find any clear answers, that's not what I'm going for here. I don't want you to just brush it over as I don't know. I want you to explore, and you can explore things further and enlist your classmates' help as you read their posts and make comments on your own. But this will be a great opportunity to build on each other's comments. And like I've mentioned in our lecture, I think we do better when we work together. So I included a short video that explains a little bit more about it in a video format, and the girl has a really cool accent. So just note her comment that ignorance is no excuse to break copyright laws. If you say, oh, I didn't know, it's a very expensive, ignorant, I don't know. So she talks kind of fast. You may want to turn on the captions to capture it all, but it's a good video. So it's in my post under the discussion 4 if you want to see it and check it out that way. Are there any questions before we move forward? All right, and who has had a chance to look at week 4, the assignment that we are going to be doing? Okay, so week 4, our last post or last discussion forum. Super sad about that one. Okay. All right. So for week 4, we're going to be talking about well, like I said, in this lecture, we're going to be going over the 19 rules of typography. But in our assignment, you're going to be creating a poster. So you get to pick your favorite rule, and we're going to create a typographic poster design. So the objectives for this assignment is to identify and define the difference between decorating and communicating when using effects on type. And so I want you to apply type within a grid to assure proper alignment and flow of text. So why is this relevant? Well, there are times when you may find yourself unable to find imagery that fits the need of your design project, or when you need a different approach than using images to clarify your text. This is when having some practice in creating interesting designs with type along the way will give you an alternative and the ability to create some pretty unique design work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's see here. Yeah, we're going to talk about organizing text a little bit. I want to see all of the rules of typography included. I want you to be mindful of your letter spacing and your line spacing, tracking, leading, your alignment and line breaks, fonts and styles. So I want you to communicate. The point here is to communicate, not decorate. So I don't want you to feel like you have to include graphics and things like that. That's not even allowed in the assignment anyways. So it kind of forces you to be creative, not only use the typography, but figure out how you can explain the point of what's going on. So there's a big difference between design and decoration. Design is a process that includes planning for a specific purpose. Designers focus on communication, human interaction, cultural influences, historical movements, and even aesthetics. Decoration, on the other hand, is adorning an object with lots of embellishments and without any purpose than the decoration itself. It's just kind of there. So, decorators are only interested in dressing things up with no concern for functionality, clarity of communication, logic, or even interactive processes. But design is. And almost always the decorations will hinder and not help the communication. So instead of just kind of flowering your project with embellishments, we don't want it to become distracting from the message. So distracting objects that draw the attention away from the intended message can be found in a lot of different ways, but usually if there's an element on the page that does not, it doesn't, I should say, doesn't have a purpose, then it doesn't need to be there. So for example, choosing an interesting but legible font with a personality that fits the message for a headline. This is communicating as the designer. Adding a stroke, a heavy drop shadow, even a gradient color fill to the text in order to make it pop is decorating without considering the message. What good does a heavy drop shadow do? I always told my students, if you feel the need to add a drop shadow or a gradient color, it means you need to change your font color. It means you can't see the font. You'll need to change the font color or the font size, but to avoid stroking your text. That is a big no-no in the design world. And typography can help. Understanding the rules of typography can help. What the do's and don'ts. It's hard to keep track of it all. Sometimes you just get docked points. You don't understand, well, why I did X, Y, Z. Why did I lose points? And it's simply because not all of the rules of typography were followed. So we'll all be held accountable for it. You're going to be graded. Your design's going to be graded along the line, making sure that you followed those rules. But keep in mind, typography can help the communication through the designer's font choices, color application, text arrangement, even positioning, and the ability to achieve a good hierarchy. So, again, line breaks, fonts, styles, all this plays a big part. So let's talk about those 19 rules of typography for a minute. And I want to kind of go through them quickly, but I also want to demo them so that you can see what it looks like, what you're supposed to do, not supposed to do. So let me see. Let's first look at this rule. It's kind of, these are out of order, but Rules must first be understood before they can be broken. As a designer has been doing this for, oh gosh, I would say 15 years, a very long time. I've come to understand why rules are there and what they're there to help with. Every now and then, as a designer, you do break the rules, but you do it in a very stylistic, tasteful way. Breaking the rules of type can also break out of the bounds of the norm, which can also grab attention. But you have to understand what the rules are before you can go breaking them. So you need to be able to make sure you're doing it on purpose, your design is on purpose and not by accident. And that's the difference here. So once you have a good foundation of what the rules are, you can freely journey into the terrain, anything that's unconventional or maybe captures the attention that you need. All right, so I'm trying to figure out what would be best here. I think I'm going to pull up my desktop and we're going to go through the rules as we have it. So bear with me. I'm going to share my desktop. So it's going to get busy. There's going to be a lot of windows open, but I think it'd be very helpful to see these rules put into design. And I'll just create a new document here so that we can set this up. Now you don't have to do this. I'm just going to kind of demo what each rule is saying to do or not to do, okay? This will hopefully help you visualize what it's saying, because sometimes just reading the rule doesn't really mean much until you see it. So I'm going to kind of shrink this down so I can stretch out my Illustrator a minute. And it's thinking, so while it spins its wheels, so I'm just gonna create an 8.5 by 11 just to do these demos. All right. All right, so let me get my screen nice and big so that you guys can see. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit. Now let me find the rule. Okay, so the first rule says always maintain the integrity of the type. Don't arbitrarily stretch letters. Okay, so what is that saying? Saying just that. Don't stretch it. Sometimes stretching happens when we try to resize an object up or down, and that can kind of get in the way um, and cause some skewing. So do not stretch letters. See if I can. There we go. Okay, so I'll show you what it's saying. We've got the slide over here that says stretching or squishing text is bad, bad, bad. Never do it. All right, so if I were to highlight this, and the way that you could, it's hard to stretch in Illustrator because when you just expand your text box, it doesn't really do anything to your font. But if I were to go to type, create outlines, now it becomes a vector. Now if I pull the box, look at that. Look what it does. It totally stretched it. Or it could go the other way. You're trying to expand the box now, and it's stretching your type. So what do we do? How do we resize type without stretching it? Well, it's a very simple thing. You hold down Shift, and that will expand your text by constraining the proportions. So you don't experience that stretching or squishing. So this is bad. There's the squishing. This is bad. There's the stretching. So the rule is saying you just want to maintain the integrity of the type, meaning don't stretch it, don't squish it, don't mess with the proportions. And if you need to resize, you hold down the Shift button as you click and drag your anchor points up or down. Okay, this will help you resize by maintaining and constraining the proportions. All right. Okay, there's another one. So we'll get rid of this one. So the other one talks about tracking, okay? What's tracking? What's letting? What's the difference between the two? So when it comes to tracking, tracking is the space between your letters. So if I, let me expand this font a little bit so you can see it. So tracking as global as the sentence. So the space between your letters is tracking. If I wanted to expand the space between the letters, I could do this. Okay? And notice how the space between each letter is increasing. Or it could go the other way. I could decrease the space, decrease the tracking, almost to a point where it's not even legible, right? So in this case, letter spacing is key, or letter spacing is key. So um, you definitely want to make sure that you have the difference down. Now, letting is the space between lines of text. So if you have a sentence, the space between lines of text, so I'm decreasing the tracking, and they're touching or they're into into each other, kind of running into each other, the ascenders and descenders, or it could be such spaced out tracking to the point where it's almost disconnected. So we want to maintain a good even amount of tracking and an even amount of letting. All right, the next rule talks about lines of type with too little space between them. So you want to slow the reading process by opening up the type. So if there's too much space, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute, we're gonna go to type, fill with placeholder text, and then I'm just gonna shrink this font size down so we can kind of get a feel for what it's doing. And I'm going to just go with fill with placeholder text. Now, pretend you had just a big, large body of text. And sometimes when you have text, it can be overwhelming to the reader. There's too much text. We tend to just kind of gloss over it and not look at it unless it's visually interesting that, we need something that catches our attention. So lines of type with too little space between them kind of slow the reading process, meaning this is a good amount of letting between these. That's a good balance. But what if they were like this? Now it's hard. You almost have to look twice at what this is saying. But by opening up the type, adding 1 or 4 points of letting, readability can dramatically improve how well and how quickly the message is written. So tracking and letting can be used to set a mood for the text and the direct reading. So if you have something that's very text heavy, if you're able to at all, please make sure that you adjust the letting so that you have more space in between the lines of text. This will allow some breathing room for the reader and won't make everything look so cramped. Are there any questions about this? All right, again, we were talking about letting, so just adjusting the line spacing improves readability. Now, for optimum readability, if we're talking about how easy something is read, you want to use a flush left or a ragged right type alignment. Okay, what does that mean? Well, let's get our type tool and we'll go to Window, open up Type, and go to Paragraph. And here's our alignment options right here. So if you hover over each one, it will tell you what it is. But the align left, ragged right means all the letters are lined up flush on the left side, with a ragged right side meaning none of the letters line up on the right side. So ragged means they don't line up, but everything is flush and lines up perfectly on the left. This is centered, so if I were to center it, but the two that you want to stick with is left alignment or a right alignment with a ragged left. So in special situations, You can use other type alignments. Like I said, once you understand this rule, then you can break it. Flush right, center, justified, but don't let centered be your go-to. Everything does typically need to be, it kind of defaults to the align left alignment. Now, if you were to do a justify, it starts spacing these words out to fill in the gaps so that it's flushed on each side. And you'll notice as the text box gets wider, the words kind of get more space in between them. So it's uneven spacing. We don't want that. So we're going to stick with our left alignment. So intentional exceptions to this rule can create emphasis. It can also guide the reading rhythm, but it can also hinder and hurt the optimum readability. So we want to make sure we're kind of defaulting to that standard align left. And my computer really didn't like what I was doing. So we'll have to wait just a minute while it catches up as it spins its wheel. Oh, I think it's trying to save. I think I saved it out of force of habit. We won't save this document. Okay. Rule 9 says use appropriate line lengths. Lines that are too short or too long can disrupt the reading. So look at this, tracking as global. These two lines of text are much shorter than the paragraph below it. So it throws it off. It almost looks like it's disrupted. Something's missing. But when you're working with type, a maximum of about 70 characters, maybe 10 to 12 words per line, is thought to be the most acceptable. Now, if you're creating your own line breaks, consider the content and the emphasis that you're creating. So line breaks can be created by, putting a return, breaking up the paragraphs so they're not so long. This does help with readability. All right, and then again, line length and breaks affect the readability of the text. So medium length is easiest for reading, just like I've got here. But if we were to expand the line like this, I think this is less effective than if we were to do a short, small column. And orphans and widows create distracting emphasis as well. So if you see any word, so say this magna was the word that was at the very end, it's all by itself, and we call that a widow. So we want to make sure that we move that up to the next line, or we move something down next to it so that it's not by itself. You can also correct this by expanding or shrinking your text boxes to make sure that you have that you can fit that word up. So you kind of have to play with it. Orphans and widows are things you want to look out for. Also, anytime you do columns and there's one word hanging out at the top, it's an orphan, and we want to make sure we steer clear of that. They can create a lot of distraction, and so that's kind of why we tell you not to. Line length and breaks can affect the readability of the text. Medium length is perfect. Breaks in logical places also aids in the readability. And then the organization of information. Orphans and widows can create distracting emphasis. So if this one is, if you already always have a word dangling at the end of your paragraph or your sentence, it's going to look a little weird. So disconnected even, or maybe the message is empty. So we want to make sure that we have a full, vibrant text box with proper line breaks and proper length. All right, so we're getting into the terminology here. So I have it highlighted here. The widow, it's a very short line, usually one word or the end of a hyphenated word. At the end of the paragraph or column. This creates unintentional emphasis, and it can interrupt the reader's eye and diminish the readability. So if you see this widow kind of hanging out, or maybe something is hyphenated, you can adjust that two ways. If you highlight this paragraph of text, open up your paragraph box and click hyphenate, or deselect hyphenate, I should say, you get rid of those hyphens. See right here, there's a hyphen. So if I select this paragraph and click hyphenate or uncheck hyphenate, it no longer wraps words around. So the spacing is much, much better. And I like the align left, ragged right, personally. Are there any questions about this? All right, so let's talk about the orphan then. As you can see on my slide, it's anytime you have two columns of text. Let me see if I can bring this over and create it for you. Okay, so say that this all wrapped around, and this is the short word or two that's left at the end of the sentence, and these columns are wrapped around. This is considered an orphan. So it's just a single word, or maybe it's a part of a word, or a very short line that appears at the beginning of a column or a page. This can result in really poor horizontal alignment at the top of the page, so we want to steer clear of that. A few things you can do is adjust your tracking or the size, width, or height of your text box. That's another quick way to get rid of an orphan. But either way, we don't want them hanging around. We want to be able to give them a good home. So we're going to put them in the original column. Are there any questions as we are going through this? Everyone seems to have a pretty good handle on it. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the next rule, you want to avoid widows and orphans whenever possible, and we just talked about what each one is. There is an exception to this. The emphasis created by a widow can be used intentionally, although I've never seen it. So I don't think that there's, unless you're trying to, call to action or something, but this is probably a good rule to stick by. Just be aware of them, I should say. All right, rule 2, be mindful not to use too many different typefaces at once. So let's do a demonstration on what this could look like. I'm going to go over to this, and I'm designing an invitation or maybe a paragraph of text. And I'm just going to go through giving each line a different font. And I want you to tell me, what does this do for the readability? What does this do for the continuity of the font? All right, so I used 4 different fonts here. When is too many too many? Want to take a guess? And the answer is, if you're going above 2 or even 3 fonts, I think you've used too many. For the wedding invitation, we were only supposed to use 2. There were a small handful of students who used 3 or 4 different fonts, just like you see here. And they were trying to make it look so nice, but the problem is it just, it was, I don't know. There were just too many typefaces. It separated the message. It was hard to read, and there was no hierarchy. So you want to be mindful not to use too many. And when too many different typefaces are used, the reader's going to be unable to determine what is and is not important. So based off of this right here, what is the most important thing? Right. So the hierarchy is what we're going to be looking for, and that's what we're looking for at church, or I'm sorry, not at church, but that's what we're looking for in class. We're trying to um, make these connections, get this message across, but it's hard to do it with too many fonts. So we want to make sure that we're only using a few. Now we say 2, so if I was going to use a fancy font, I'm probably going to pick a very, like a sans serif font that does not compete with the design. So I don't want anything with frills or anything. I'm going to pick a very basic serif. So this Times New Roman, or I'm sorry, not Times New Roman, but this, what's this one? Alex Brush, this scriptive handwritten font, paired with this sans serif system font looks very good together. There's contrast, but yet this is very clean to read, and it's kind of the opposite of the one above. So, all right, that is using too many fonts. And as we see in the slide, combining fonts, adequate contrast in style, weight, personality, just like we did for our wedding invitation. So we want to make sure, as you can see here, that there's different contrast in style and weight, personality. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you tell me, in what way does this slide present contrast? Okay, in color. So color is one. What's another element on the page that creates contrast? Size. You mentioned size. Okay. Yeah, the weight of the font. So is it bold? Is it regular? Is it light? Yeah, and even the style. So as you can see on the left, we've got that script font contrasting with the sans serif font. And this combining fonts, this recipe for combining fonts does have a personality. This now makes a message seem a little bit more interesting because something's not too much is going on and we're not busying up a page. So kind of rule of thumb here when you combine fonts is not to combine more than 3, but I would say just stick with 2. Because even when you have 2, you've got the different font styles within that font family that you can use. Bold, ultra condensed, regular, light, whatever it is. So you've got a myriad of options in there. So even that's like using 10 fonts, but you're using the same font family, but just different styles. All right, so we're at the next rule. So avoid combining typefaces that are too similar in appearance. So again, that goes back to it's the opposite of the previous rule. So here we've got contrast because I have a scriptive font and then I have a sans serif font. Those are very two different fonts. But what happens when I use this font, which is system font, and I use this one, which is Helvetica? Is there enough stark difference? What if I used Arial? I think Arial and Helvetica are even that much similar. So I'm using two to, and aside from spacing, they really look about the same. They're too similar. So what's going to stand out? If these fonts are too similar and they're paired together, does anything stand out? No, not at all, right? So if the reason for combining typefaces is to create emphasis, then it's probably important to avoid the ambiguity caused by combining types that are too similar in appearance. So we really want to add emphasis. So we're going to use a font that is a little different from the body text. And in this case, we'll do this. So this contrasts in weight and it also contrasts in size and width and how condensed it is in spacing. And this gives it some personality. All right, when you combine fonts, you have options of doing bold, light, oblique. So here's a bold. Let me find something that will give us that option. So let's go to Minion Pro. So here's a bold. You can also do bold condensed, or they have medium or regular. Some fonts even have like a light version. But again, there's like the italics within that font. So you have a lot of options. There's black extended versus light condensed, all caps and script. So it's pretty interesting. There is a fun game I wanted to show you, and I'm gonna pull it up on my web browser. So just give me 1 second as I get this going for us. All right, and it's called typeconnection.com. So I really think you should kind of check it out, but this is pretty cool. It's almost like a dating game. So you click the center, it's hit play. All right, and it says life's too short to live alone, so we're going to choose a main character to match. So they've got different kinds of fonts. We're going to go with this Adobe Garamond. I'll click this one. And it's really cool because it gives like a little summary. I'm a modern day high Renaissance man. Um, and then it gives the history. It's a reliable, neutral font with a spirited, dynamic italic. And despite the original's prevalence across Europe, several revivals were actually based on the work of Jean Janin, which happened to be the creator of the font. So here is Adobe Garamond. If you click on it, and it says, only fools rush in. Choose a strategy for finding the Adobe Garamond Pros match. So are you relying on the family? If you highlight it, we'll explain what it means. What's comfortable can be easier, but may not be that romantic. So remember, if you're just going to pick what's similar in that family, but if you want to seek something that's similar to it, you could look closely. Pairing a lookalike requires an eye for detail. Or you could embrace the other and find a complete opposite. Opposites attract and can make relationships more exciting. So, and then the last one, explore the past. So think deeply. Sharing history and influences can lead to a pleasant future. So in this case, we want contrast. So I'm going to click this one, the embrace the other. And then this one gives me really good contrasting fonts. So I'm going to use this bold one. Send them on a date so you can combine them. Right here, you've got the Adobe Garamond right here. And then you've got the other font, which is Maple. If I click this box, it will show me the differences with the serifs and the sans serifs. Just like that. And you can set them on a date. So you can click on this link. So why this pairing works? Well, Adobe Garamond Pro and Maple combine professionalism with good cheer. Garamond presents the facts, and quirky Maple bring warmth to the relationship. So as a text face, Garamond is buttoned up and reserved with its sharp wedge serifs, thin weight, and subtle lacrymal terminals. Garamond's quietly neutral voice leaves room for a colleague with a strong personality. So enter Maple. It's eccentric, unpredictable, and it's entertaining. And you can see the font contrast here. One has serifs, one does not. And then it goes into Adobe Garamond Pro and Maple, just kind of talking about the history of it. And also, you can kind of see it says the happy couple, and you can see the contrast that it creates, which is really neat. So already Adobe Garamond Pro and Maple go on a weekend getaway upstate where Garamond curls up with a good book and Maple savors the scent of fresh air. So there's a happily ever after in the future, it sounds like. So we've made a successful match. Now you can pick a different font here. You can see the similar, and it will kind of show you why, maybe in size, maybe in stroke, maybe in width. If you send them on a date, you'll just click the link and we'll talk about this. So it says the happy couple, these two are good contrasts. So Universe and Glypha, these attend a gallery opening where they discuss building code violations and their desire for a better work-life balance. So anyways, it will tell you whether or not you made a successful match or whether you didn't. But I want to give you a minute or two. I want you to just kind of play around with the website a little bit, because what I love about this is it gets you very familiar with what makes a contrasting font. We might think it looks different enough, but it's not when you kind of look at things. So choose your main character. So once you go to this website, typeconnection.com, and you can kind of choose, what are you looking for? What's this explore the past? Maybe we want to look at that one. All right, and then you can send them on a date. Oh, and then here they say both have lightness and weight that works at a range of sizes, but as a face from the digital era, Archer has had no exposure to Apollo's photo setting methods. So, meaning we are not able to use this contrasting font because it's too similar. All right. So I want you to tell me if, what font did you find? What was your match? And then this will also give you a maybe not. They don't belong together. So we want to make sure we're making the right connection. We're using the contrast and the bold in the type. And we're also making contrast with the font style and the font size. All right, so I just kind of explore this a little bit. Take a look about the site. This is a really cool site. The strategies, meet the matches. It's a really neat site, and you can see if you're ever trying to pair fonts together, okay, what goes together? Oh, okay, here we go. And then it gives you, this is the Century and Futura font. Perfect. I mean, these are professionals that have already done the hard work for you. They take the guessing work out of it. So you can just come here and look, okay, I'm going to use these two fonts and combine them, and that's going to be my contrasting fonts. And notice how they only have two listed. They have two contrasting fonts. They don't have three, they don't have four, because very rarely will you ever use that many fonts on then you're starting to break the design rule. So just keep that in mind as well. All right, let's go back to our slides. Hope you have some fun with that. As I'm lecturing, go ahead and play around with it. I do think it's very helpful. I'm going to go back to my desktop. So many screens, so I apologize. Let's close out of this. Okay. All right, we talked about the weights. Keep going to our next one. So avoid using too many different type sizes. So we talked about different fonts, but okay, so say we're using two, just like we had here. And there I'm going to pick a font. Here we go. So if I was making a wedding invitation and I had, my fonts here, and I'm going to give this one of 13. This one is a 16. This is the same font. I'm going to give this 8. All right, does this look very cohesive as it is? Probably not. We want to make sure that they have the same size and weight at the same time. Some experts recommend using no more than 2 or 3 sizes, one for the display, like the headline title, and then one for the text type. But the body copy should all be the same. So there is one for disclaimers, which is really itty-bitty, really small, but be sure to have at least 2-point size difference to have a very clear contrast. You need about 2 points difference in size to get that contrast that you're looking for. But Rule 6 does say avoid using too many different type sizes and weights at the same time. So sometimes I'll design my project or my ad or whatever it is that my client hired me to design. And what I'll do is I'll just kind of sit on it for a little bit and kind of see what it's, does it have the effect I'm going for? But either way, I really want that contrast to be there. So I kind of need to make things, sometimes you need to dramatize the project a little bit, make it pretty dramatic in size difference so that you can see. But I would stick to maybe 1 or 2 different size weights and points for your design. Again, it's a rule, but it can be broken because sometimes there's exceptions to the rule. All right, so this isn't particularly a rule, but it is hierarchy. And in terms of hierarchy, we want to make sure that we organize and direct the reader by grouping our information, any related elements on the page, to kind of create a focal point of interest. So if all of this was the same size and same font, I want you to tell me what's the most important information. There'd be no way to tell me what's more important because I haven't told you what's more important. I haven't told you through my design. But if I were to do this, what if I were to increase the font? Oops. Sorry about that. What if I was to increase the font and the weight of this? Well, this one won't let me do that, but what if I were to increase this? Now, if I were to ask which paragraph is more important, it would probably be the one that's the largest, right? That would be what I would guess. And the answer is yes. You're the designer. You're telling me, the reader, where to put my eyes. So if you can see the slides here on the right, hierarchy organizes and directs the reader's eyes. So a well-executed visual hierarchy will guide the reader effortlessly through your design from beginning to end. So as we can see here, we've got the image and the headline, which are immediate attention grabbers, and they're also positioned where? They're positioned at the top, right? That's where the headline goes. That's usually where your graphic will go. Now, as you move down to the next line, organizes and directs, it's still all caps, it's still bolded, but it's in a different color for contrast. And it's very small, or I'm sorry, it's not small, it's well, it's smaller than the headline. So as we're moving down these lines of text, it's same cap, same weight, font weight. We're just getting a little smaller. And then finally at the bottom, there's this really nice fine print on this poster, and that's just for your information. Like, it's not important. It's not the main message. But the layout of this ad directs your eye where to go. It tells you where to look first, where to look last, and it does the job just based off of size alone. Are there any comments? Okay, we'll keep going. So hierarchy and grouping. So again, we practiced that when we've done the last two assessments because we had to lay out a page with text, body copy. We had to have a headline, which we had to format. So everything was based off of hierarchy, right? Headline was where? It was at the top, right? And then what came next? The body copy. You had your byline, which was tiny. That's usually at the end, or it can be at the top as well, but it's very small. Then we had the pull quote, right? Pull quote was a form used hierarchy. You had to make the pull quote stand out, right? So you had to make it bigger. So there was font contrast, combinations, font size and style were different. But hierarchy and grouping can be done in color, it can be done in leading or grouping. So there's a lot of different ways. I have a video I want to share. So I'm going to pull this video up. And I want you to tell me what you think.
This video is going to show a very quick and simple depiction of how hierarchy and grouping can bring a graphic design piece to life. Now, hierarchy is basically the ordering of information. What do you want the viewer to see first, second, third, last? How do you want their experience to go in the reading of your pieces? And grouping is a way to call attention to things that you want to emphasize in your layouts. So this is a very small, simple ad for an Italian restaurant, and you'll notice that the one on the left is informative, but it's really kind of boring. That has the name of the restaurant and the information. Everything is centered. It just fills the space, and it is, fairly dull. It's really unlikely that anybody would notice or read this. The second version is better. It's still a little bit static, a little dull. The name of the restaurant is at the top. They put the tagline just beneath it, and the contact information is down at the bottom. It's okay, but again, it doesn't use much in the way of layout interest. It only uses scaling and type style to give interest to the ad. So it really could be a lot better. The third one is starting to really work. Okay, you'll notice a couple things have changed in this one. The name of the restaurant is not at the top. Rather, the tagline with the first two words emphasized is now at the top, acting as a headline. And that serves to lead the viewer into the ad. Notice also that the name of the restaurant and its contact info is in the middle of the page, set in a flush left paragraph a little bit over to the right, which calls attention to the negative space next to it. So it really leads the eye to it by virtue of that negative space. And that's a real nice graphic design tip to keep in mind. And it is balanced at the bottom with that award-winning information. So the hierarchy of that third version is excellent. The fourth one is even better. You'll notice a few typeface changes, and the thing that really makes the fourth one stand out is the use of the reversed text for the name of the restaurant and the contact information. It's in a beautiful black bar, so that name really pops. And they're using a decent typeface too that helps to emphasize the nature of the restaurant. So we see a nice hierarchy here. Gourmet dining is the first thing we see, but then our eye does travel down to the name of the restaurant and the information about its location. And then the eye is free to travel around the rest of the ad that talks about what they serve and their, information about when they're open and etc. And then we finish with the Critics' Choice information about the award that they won. And so hierarchy is really strong here, and visually it's very strong because it has some nice balance of black and white, and it's using negative space in a strong manner. So this is a great example of how you can take something simple and work it so that it becomes much more impactful. You may want to take a screenshot of this and use it as a reference when you have similar tasks to perform in your design work. So keep in mind that hierarchy, the ordering of information, and grouping, how you group things both for sense and also for visual appeal, are two things that are extremely important to know and to become comfortable with in your design work. Thanks.
All right, so
I thought she did a good job of explaining. We're going to cancel that and we'll close this video out. Okay, so I thought she did a pretty good job of explaining hierarchy and grouping and why it's important and how we can take a good design and make it better, and then how we can take a better design and make it best. And so it's kind of, I thought she explained it well, that she not only did the design include hierarchy, but it also included different elements to create grouping and make things stand out. And so I think that really helped the design pop a lot. So, all right, let's go through another one before we go to break. All right, this one says emphasize elements within text with discretion and without disturbing the flow of reading. And again, I think this rule follows along with the explanation that was given in the video previously. You can use italics, underline, type. What were some other elements on her designs that were used to create emphasis? Yeah, we saw there wasn't color, but yeah, she used black and white, but there was that black box with the reverse text on it. So by using color in a different way, reversing that text really made things stand out because it wasn't done to the whole page, just to that specific word or phrase. And that made that important word or phrase stand out. So different typeface, all capital letters can help things stand out. Bold type. So in this case over here, with this paragraph, yes, it's a different size, but what if I wanted to make it all caps? I would go to type, change case, and click on uppercase. So now I've changed it to all caps. So that's another way to do it. Another thing I can do, I got to find a font that will let me do a bold. Let's try Helvetica. All right, there's bold. What about italics? Bold italics. That also makes something stand out. I could go even larger. This is larger than this text above. This large text emphasizes a message. So you want to use minimum means for maximum results, meaning you don't want to use every effect under the sun, but we do want to pick one or two and use it on the most important information on the page, okay? So just kind of be selective with what you want to emphasize, and that will make those elements stand out even more. If you're emphasizing everything, then again, it's just going to be a wash. Everything's going to look the same. So we want to make sure, or too busy. So we want to make sure we're only highlighting what's really important. All right. And then when working with type or even color, it's very tempting to use a lot of it. So we want to make sure that for sufficient contrast, in order to have sufficient contrast exists between the type and its background, too little contrast in hue or value or saturation or even a combination of these factors can really result in type that's impossible to read. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's get a colored box here. So I'm going to draw a colored box behind my text. Now, does this black box help you read my text any better? No, of course not, because why? What color is my text? It too is black. So in order to create contrast, I would need to either have a white box or white text. And I can change that right down here on my fill. So this creates contrast. This is okay. This does make something stand out. What if we were to go back and say my font stayed black? I'll be even more dramatic. Let's see. I'm going to use this dark brown. And I'm going to send this to back. Okay. Can you read my text? Is my text very legible? No, because there's too little contrast in the hue or the color of these two factors. Black and brown are very close to each other on the color scale. Both are dark colors. And you don't have to remember what's close to each other. You just have to remember, or you just have to know dark and dark do not go. Light and light do not go. So we want to make sure that if you're going to have a dark background, you need what? A light colored text, and vice versa. Just like that. Now that is much better because there's appropriate contrast that exists between these two things, the type and the element behind it. Now, if I were to go back to that black font, say I really want black font, then you need to lighten your background. Maybe to a lighter brown or even lighter than that. Okay, so now there's appropriate contrast. You have a very dark colored font. I think that's as dark as you can get, black, and a light brown background. So this is very helpful, all right? And same thing goes if you know, on the reverse. So back here, same rule applies, rule 19. The colors with the same saturation and value are going to fight for attention. Let one take the obvious lead. So in this case, we could lighten this even more. Just like that. Or even, you know, on the flip side, what if our text was, you know, pretty light with a light background? That's extremely hard to read. So colors with the same saturation value are going to fight for attention either way, whether it's light and light or dark and dark. So we really want to make sure that one is dramatically different than the other in terms of color and saturation. Does that make sense? And even this hurts my eyes to even demo this and look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring back that nice dark black font. Oh, that's so much better. You can really read it a lot easier. So this is a good example of Rule 19. And in fact, I might be using Rule 19 for our demo. We'll see. We'll see which one I pick. All right, and then again, going back to the principles of design. So we didn't cover a lot of this in this class, but all need to be considered and implemented in typography. Is there contrast? Well, we just went over that. Is there emphasis? Yes, there is. What element is being emphasized right now? The middle paragraph, right? Because it's all caps, it's bold, it's bigger than the other font and text. So there's some emphasis going on here. And had this been a call to action or a message, this would have been the element that stood out the most. Is there repetition? Repetition can be found in color, using the same color throughout my whole document. That's repetition. There's their unity. Well, it depends on how many repetitive elements on the page there are. And then alignment. Is everything aligned together? Is there balance? And then proximity and grouping. You don't want things too spread out or it will look disconnected. So if this is part of the same sentence, bring it over here, grab my type tool. Oh, that's much better. So say this is its own paragraph. Okay, I want to make sure there's enough space between there that it's clearly indicating that. All right. And then here, let's go. This is old slides, but we'll get into the history of type. And there's a quote here by Dmitry Kirsanov. It says, to be font literate, a designer has to study the history and the principles of font design. So I love this quote because I think that it's important to know the fonts that are out there before you start combining them and designing with them. It's very important you know their history. And there's a few videos that we'll probably watch after our demo, but I wanted to just get these rules of typography out there. We didn't cover all 19, but I wanted to show you the most important ones. I demoed a lot of them, so this should give you an idea of what to do with your poster. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's expected for assignment for when we come back. So we're going to go to our 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll dive into our assignment. If you'd like to follow along, please open up your Illustrator file. I'm going to show you a shortcut to setting up your document, and you're going to love it. All right. Stretch your legs. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. All right, guys, so we're back, and what we're going to do is go back into Illustrator because we've got our assignment 4 to go over. So I wanted to show you a little trick to setting up your document, and here's the trick. You don't have to set it up at all, because if you go into assignment 4, underneath assignment 4, and click on the link, it says download a text document for the rules. You can pick a rule from the document, but also if you scroll down, there's 2 other links. A noticeable and functional grid to keep the design organized and cohesive. So these are grid templates already sized for you. So you don't have to set up an 11 by 17 template. I clicked on the Illustrator one, or you can do the InDesign vertical 12 column grid. So what I'll do is click on the InDesign vertical, and I'm going to open it up in my InDesign. I think I was going to do it in Illustrator, but I think it might be best if I do it in InDesign. So we'll close out of this, and I'll just open it right up. I'm going to pull it up, and then I'll share my screen so you can see it. And like always, it runs so slow, so I do apologize for that. All right. So this will give you a minute to download it on your computer so you have a chance to work with me. I'll be in InDesign today. All right, here we go. So the basis for the assignment. As for this assignment, you're going to be designing a typographical poster, but not just any typographical poster. The theme of the poster will be your choice of one of the 19 rules of typography that we've been talking about in week 2, week 3 course media, but also in week 4's lecture, and also the document that they provide for you under the assignment 4. So you're going to need to use a grid to lay out the structure, but don't let that throw you off because they've graciously provided you a vertical grid or a horizontal grid to work with in either InDesign or Illustrator. And the file size is just that. So you don't have to even set up the document at all. And here's the good news. Be creative. You can now design based off of your own approach. So apply the principles and information from this week's course media along with what you've been learning so far in this course. But this poster should be interesting and engaging and not simply a page layout. We're going to be using the grid as a guide, but allow yourself to kind of break out of it as needed for visual interest. So again, understanding the rules and then breaking the rules. Once you have a good foundation, you can kind of break the rules to be unconventional a little bit. So if you feel the need, please do. Just remember, design with purpose, okay? Everything needs to be mindful of every element and its placement. Don't just arbitrarily put things on a page. We need to make sure that if you're going to do an align left with a ragged right alignment, you need to be able to explain why you did that. What purpose is it serving? So just allow yourself to kind of break out of the rules if you need to, but be mindful of every element. Also, you're going to be graded on whether or not you observe the CRAP principles of design, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. This is all going to help ensure that everything has an effective place in the composition. Is everyone familiar with the CRAP principles? If you have been keeping up with our course media, this should be it should be a breeze. It should just be a review. If you have not, I recommend that you go back. Other classes are also covering it too. This will not be the last time that you hear of this or work with it, but you'll be using these principles throughout your career in design, in the design industry. So be aware of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Those are just grouping, emphasis, how to create emphasis in your design. Okay, so the poster is going to need to include the rule and the number listed, the paragraph of text covering the rule of typography. So basically you pick a rule, any rule, you have 19 to choose from, and then you're going to highlight that featured rule by incorporating a visual example of its function or of its failure. Or no, it says and failure if it has one. So you're going to the right way and then the wrong way. And you're going to observe any other applicable rule in the design as well. So you're going to be communicating this rule through your design. Graphic elements created only by type or similar shapes can create interest and emphasize the function of the rule, but no photography, no graphics that way. Only type-related characters. Type characters only. Glyphs are okay, or simple shapes may be used, but no images or illustrations may be used at all. So a noticeable and functional grid to keep the design organized and cohesive is what we're trying to achieve here. So grid templates are below on the link under the assignment 4. Click one or the other depending on which program you want to design in. And the good news is you get to pick. So if you feel more comfortable in InDesign, go for InDesign. If you want to do this in Illustrator, do it in Illustrator. Me personally, I feel like it's easier to design layouts in InDesign and then logos in Illustrator, but that's personal preference. Do what you feel comfortable with. Now, credit for your text is all under there. There's a book by it. It's a digital copy, but we're pulling some of the rules from this book. And I just really recommend that you study up on these rules because this won't be the last time that you see or hear or apply them, okay? Specs are choosing one or the other, Illustrator or InDesign, 11 by 17 tabloid. That doesn't mean anything right now because all you have to do is open up the grid file. It is all laid out for you. So you don't even have to set up your document. So that saves you a whole step there. All right. So let's begin. The rule that I'm going to cover is Rule 19. And that one talks about contrast. And I thought that would be an easy one to demo because it's, again, we went over contrast in terms of color, light and dark, and the saturation of colors. So this is going to be an easy one for me to apply. So I'm going to, now as you're designing in your grid, you can, these are merely for your to line things up, alignment purposes, but if you want to stand back and take a look at your design, because once you start putting things on your page, it will start looking really busy. So just go to View, Grids and Guides, and then you can click on, Hide Rulers. It will hide your rulers, or you can go to View, Show Rulers, and then your rulers will pop up. You can also go to toggle between, if you hit W on your page, or I'm sorry, on your keyboard, W will help you toggle between the preview mode and your work mode, okay? So W will help give you this view, or you can see your grid and line layout. All right, first things first, this is in a 3-column template, so I'm going to grab my rectangle box. Hold on, I'm gonna close out Illustrator really quick, and I'm going to expand my InDesign screen so that you can see it. So give me just a second. There's a little lag. I think I have too many programs open. Okay. There we go. I'll close out of this and grab my toolbar. All right, so I've got my rectangle tool selected. And what I'm going to do is create what we call contrast with color. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and I'm going to expand this. Probably to the center of the page. It's kind of what I'm after. And then I'm going to fill it with a color, and I'm going to pick something that will stand out. So I'm going to do blue. Blue is a nice color. So as you can see, I've got half white, half blue. That right there is contrast, dark and light in terms of saturation and color. And then I'm going to grab my type tool. I'm going to click and drag, and this is where I'm going to put the rule. So I'm going to type out the number 19. But obviously it's very small, so I need to get a larger font. I'm going to use Futura. Oops, gotta highlight it first. I'm gonna just use a standard sans serif font. Feel free to use any font though in your font books, or anytime you've gone to Typekit and you've downloaded a cool font. Remember, we're after legibility, so we really need to make sure it's legible. I might try one that I found, Galaxy Polaris. This is a cool font. I just like the way the numbers are shaped. But I do want it to be a little bolder, so let's do Futura. That was a, yeah, I like those numbers a lot better. And to create contrast, I'm going to use a big, bold number on that. Now, here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this, do this right here, very, very big. I can also go to Type, Create Outlines. So it will no longer be editable with the Type tool, but it will also kind of vectorize it, and it will allow me to expand this a little bit. I'm going to make sure I'm lining things up with my grid. I'm using these rulers to make sure things are lined up properly, just like that. Okay. Now, when I do this, you'll notice that it looks like there's not enough white space in between the 9 and the blue box, but too much space between the 1 and the blue box. So I'm going to break the rule, and I'm going to kind of bring my blue box in a little bit so that there's an even amount of space between the 1 and the 9. Now, do you see there's breathing room here and the same amount of breathing room here? So even though I'm not using the grid exactly, I am breaking the rule a little bit. Visually, this makes sense with my eye. Another thing that I can do is I can back up a little bit and kind of tighten up the tracking before I create outlines so that it's a little closer together. So I can go to Object, or sorry, Type, Create Outlines. And I will expand this. I'm going to make sure I'm lining it up with my guides or my grids. And because I tightened up the tracking a little bit, I'm going to make sure that there's an even amount of space between the 9 and the 1. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit because I don't need it to be that large. There we go. And for the 9, let's see if it will, whoops, bring it back. Okay. I might have to redo this because I'm in InDesign, which doesn't let you separate or ungroup your type. If you were in Illustrator, you could ungroup each number or each letter in a word, but because I'm in InDesign, it doesn't let me do that for some reason. So I'm going to go into this and we'll reformat it before. So I'm just going to do the 1. I'm going to do it one at a time. There we go. Okay, and now I'm going to expand my text. So there's the 1, and I'm going to make it bold. Now I'll go to Type, Create Outlines. And I'm going to line it up with my grids. Then I'm going to draw a 9. So I have to do this separately because I'm creating outlines. And I'm creating outlines because I can control the placement of each number a little bit better. As you could see, the spacing was a little weird when it was just in the text box. So here we go. Now I've got to be careful because I want to make sure this 9 and 1 are relatively the same length and height. There we go. Probably right about here is what I want. And I can even expand it too. I'll just have to bring that blue box in. Close enough, even amount of space. Now I can select the 9 individually and I can give it the same color. And for contrast, because the blue on the black is not enough contrast, and this is all about following the rule, I'm going to change that to white. So I've got this really cool effect here. Next, I'm going to create these little arrows. On my keyboard. I'm going to highlight them. Again, I'm going to change this to Futura. And I'm going to do bold. And in this case, I'm just going to do 1. I'll go to Type, Create Outlines. And this will allow me to kind of skew and stretch a little bit because I'm creating arrows. So I'll do one here and one here. This is my graphics that I'm including, something of visual interest. But I don't want it to be too big. I'm just going to kind of fill in this space. Okay. And then this other one, I'll give it a lighter color, and I'm going to adjust the hue on there. So contrast, I'm communicating contrast here by doing a lighter saturation and a heavier saturation on the blue. There's contrast with the reverse type and the dark type. So we've got that. So I've already communicated what my rule is going to be. I'm going to take these arrows and I'm going to copy by holding down my Alt button or my Option button on my keyboard. I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to bring these arrows here. This one I'm going to do white for contrast. I'll keep this one blue to match. And now I can just simply copy the type. I'm going to go back to my grid so I can make sure my text box is going to line up with my arrows. I want my arrows to line up all together like that. And then this is where I'll put the message. You don't have to type it. The document is provided for you. But because my computer is running very slow, I'm just going to type it to save us time. And I don't recommend typing in InDesign because unless you spell check it first. Because it's not like Word where it will underline or notify you if there's a misspelling or a wrong phrase. There we go. All right, so I've got my paragraph. Now I'm going to go back to Futura. And the reason why I'm sticking with the same font is because I'm creating unity with my document. I want everything to kind of have the same flow, same feel. I don't want to distract from the rule, from the message of this on this poster, because that's not what I'm trying to draw attention to. Font is not what I'm trying to draw attention to. I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that it's contrast that I'm trying to emphasize, or the lack of. And so I've got my type all typed out. So I'm going to keep the blue going. And I'm going to, I'll get the preview mode going so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to emphasize this too little contrast or saturation by lightening it up. I'm going to break that rule to kind of emphasize. Why? By using that light blue. So I'm using too little contrast. Why? Because it's hard to read. And that's what I want to emphasize, that if we don't use enough contrast, if we break this rule, it will be too hard to read. And I could even do that to the rest of the type if I wanted. Like this. So I'm kind of emphasizing that rule a little bit. All right, and now I'm going to go in and kind of add my graphic elements, I should say. I'm going to type the word contrast. Again, I'm keeping it Futura. That's the same font. I'm going to keep my bold font, and I'm going to use all caps. I'm going to increase the size here so you can read it a little bit better. And I'm going to give it this nice light color. And I'm going to go to Type, Create Outlines when I'm happy with it. And when you rotate an object or a text box, if you rotate and hold down the Shift button, it will lock it into a place for you. So it's not a guessing game all the time. So here I'm going to expand this because I want to stretch it. I'm basically trying to communicate contrast. And I'm going to line it up nice and close with each other. So each one is going to be a different value. So I'm going to bring this down to 45. I'm changing the opacity on it. And this one even lower. All right, so there's not enough contrast here. So as it goes down the line, the contrast is getting less and less, which makes it harder to read. All right, and then I might do that again. I'm going to highlight these. I'll copy and paste them. I'll rotate them as a group. Here I'll make it a little smaller. But I'm going to make sure my grids are on. And I could make it even more dramatic by changing the opacity, but I think that kind of gets the point across. See, as you go down on the contrast, it's just really, really hard to read. I can add a few other design elements on this if I wanted to. I'm going to bring this down. And I'm going to grab my type tool again. Again, I'm using Futura, same font. I'm going to use bold. And for this one, I'm going to change the font color to blue. Same blue I'm using. I'm going to go to Type, Create Outlines. And I'll rotate and hit Shift so it locks it into place. And this is where I'm going to fill my one. So I'm just using a bunch of typographic extras on here, but this is adding a lot of visual interest to my message. And it's also communicating the rule very well. So we've got rule number 19. I could even make these a little bit bigger if I wanted to. But I think I like this size. We'll stick with this size. Okay, let's see. These ones could even be bigger if I wanted to go a little wider. And I like this too because it directs the eye to the message, so it's pointing to the number. These ones up here are pointing to the number. These ones down here are pointing to the paragraph, which I think is very helpful. All right, and then I'm also going to take this rule number that I've already typed. You don't have to do it twice. If you've already got the elements, use it. I'm going to line everything up on this magenta line, and I'm going to increase this. I'm going to line it up with this grid. So as you can see, I'll zoom in. This text box is lined up perfectly on the same grid line as my ruler. And it's the same grid line that my number 9 is lined up with. So this is creating some unity here, and it's also creating a very cohesive design piece. So I'm using my grids to keep everything lined up. It's very important that you get used to designing in a grid, simply because it keeps things aligned, and your eye for design is a little bit better. I think that you're able to work a little bit better with it. Okay, and then last one, I will grab my 1 and 9 and paste it, and then I'm just going to make sure that they're both blue this time. And I'm going to shrink it down. And it's going to go right over this contrast text. And in this case, I'm going to scoot this 9 a little bit closer because it looks a little disconnected the way it was. I'm going to select each one. I'll kind of bring it up a little bit. This will allow me a little bit more room to expand my 19. There we go. And again, I'm using this magenta line, the margin line, as kind of my grid, my ending point for all of my elements, my text box, my arrows, my numbers, and even the contrasting words. And this I want to make sure lines up perfectly. Here, I'll show you what I'm doing. It doesn't quite touch the grid line that the 19 is touching, so I want to expand it a little bit until it lines up. And Smart Guides will turn on and say, you're there. And I'm using this magenta line to get really precise. Okay, so I'm lined up here on the left with my text box. I'm also lined up here at the top with my number. I'm going to grab my contrast text. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to try to make 19 a little bit bigger so it comes to that grid line that the contrast is laying on. There we go. Perfect. So it looks a little bit busy, but this is getting the point across. I'm emphasizing the contrast, the lack of contrast, and then the importance of having contrast. And then I'm going to grab a solid colored box. This is going to be my last design element for the page. And then here's where I can put the citation for the excerpt. So this can all go here. There we go. And I will make it Futura. This time, for adequate contrast, I need it to be white on a dark background. And I want this to be fairly small. Yeah, we're going to make it 15, maybe even 10. It doesn't have to be very big because this is not the important part of the message. So again, by using hierarchy, I'm showing, yeah, this is a very insignificant piece of the message. The big piece of the message is the rule and the visual. So here, I'll hide my guide so that you can get an idea for how I did this. All right. I can even line this up so it's off it lines up with the grid line or the magenta document line. Okay, perfect. So this is basically what you're going to be expected to do for the assignment. You're going to pick a rule and design it, emphasize it, create your message with it. Are there any questions? How did I achieve something? So for rule 1, I used, for optimum legibility, I chose classical time-tested typefaces. If you'll notice, I didn't go grabbing a fancy frilly font because they're hard to read. So don't feel like you have this freedom to go pick any font. You need to stick with the classics. The ones we've been researching are appropriate for this assignment. If you choose a font that is hard to read, it's going to hurt your design and hurt your grade. So please remember, rule number 1 is choose a classic time-tested typeface that is legible. Rule number 2 is be mindful not to use too many typefaces at one time. I am using the same typeface, which is Futura. I just used bold, and I used regular, and I used book, and then I used color to create contrast. So I didn't even need a second font. Avoid combining typefaces that are too similar. In this case, I didn't have to use a second font, so that's perfect. And then text, rule 4, set in all capital letters severely retards reading, which is why I kept the paragraph, which had the most text in it for my body copy. I did not use all caps. This would be too hard to read, too much going on. So it's easier to read if it's all lowercase. So I'm following that rule. The only time you see me using all caps is to create emphasis as far as my graphic is concerned. It's not for the main message. So if you have a large body of text, you definitely want to make sure you're only using lowercase. All right, rule 5 for text type. Use sizes that, according to legibility studies, prove most readable. I'm using, for my headline, a very large font. I would say this is probably 50 to 70 size font. And then for my contrast, this is probably 30. So I've expanded it so the headline or what it's supposed to stand out stands out. But for my text type, I'm using a very small font, which is around 30 for the poster. Everything goes out the window in terms of size for posters and billboards because you do have to design larger than life, but make sure that you can read it. Avoid using too many different types, sizes, and weights at the same time. I'm just using bold and regular, bold and book. That's the only two contrasting weight that I'm using. And then I didn't use any other type families or typefaces. Rule 7, use text types of book weight. Avoid typefaces appearing too heavy or too light. So in this case, I used a book because I want it to be legible, but Futura does offer a light version, but when I use that, it's not as legible. So I'm kind of leaning towards the book version here. Okay, and then rule 8, use typefaces of medium width. Avoid typefaces that appear extremely wide or narrow. So I picked a good one. This one's a good happy balance. This isn't too heavy. It's not too condensed. This is a very easy font size, typeface to use. I like Futura. It's a classic font. It's been used before, so we know that it's appropriate. Rule 9 for text type, you want a consistent letter and word spacing. So remember, I had to adjust the 19. There was too much space between it, so I had to do each number individually, created outlines to get that effect. And then before I even created outlines, I used the tracking. I adjusted the tracking so that they were closer together. This easily carries the eye from one line to the next. It allows the eye to flow. We didn't want the 9 and the 1 to be too disconnected. Otherwise, it wouldn't make visual sense. And rule 12, for optimum readability, you want to use a flush left, ragged right type alignment, which is the exact alignment I used here. This is a flush left, meaning everything lines up on the left, and ragged right. That's how we read. That seems to be the most consistent form of alignment that for optimum readability. And then rule 13 says strive for consistent rhythmic rags, which we've done. And rule 14, clearly indicate paragraphs, but be careful not to upset the integrity and visual consistency of the text. So I didn't use lots of paragraphs. I used one, but I did make sure to emphasize the rule in there, the whole rule, that whole line using little contrast. The whole reason why I'm designing this poster is to emphasize the fact that if you don't have contrast, it is hard to read. Rule 15, avoid widows and orphans whenever possible. I've double checked my paragraph. I don't have any of those. Rule 16, emphasize elements within the text with discretion and without disturbing the flow of reading. And then rule 17 says, always maintain the integrity of type. I didn't stretch, I didn't skew, I always held down shift before I clicked an anchor point to drag on my computer. Up or down, it doesn't matter, hold down shift and it will constrain the proportions. And rule 17 says, always maintain the integrity of type, which we did. We didn't mess with the proportions in any way. Always align letters and words on the baseline, which is what we did. We're using that grid system right here. And then when working with type and color, we ensure that sufficient contrast exists. So do you think contrast exists here between the type and its background? Absolutely. I used a dark background and the lightest text you could go to be able to read it. And so that is the whole point here. So this is the example of the assignment. I hope this helps you, kind of gets those creative juices flowing a little bit, because I do feel like this is going to be a fun assignment, something that allows you a little bit of creativity and wiggle room. But before we close, I wanted to share a video. This is our last class for the week, and so I wanted to be able to kind of show some examples here. Okay, hierarchy and grouping. Oh, we did that one already. Which one did we do? Yeah, here we go. This one is just examples of hand lettering, and I thought it was interesting in terms of font. And I'll go ahead and share it with you. We won't watch the whole thing because we have to end soon, but I did want to kind of break by showing you what you can do with font. It's pretty mind-blowing. All right.
The volume on this. Let me know if you can't hear it, if you have difficulty at all. So it's just an interview. We'll just watch a little bit of it, but hopefully it gives you some idea of what goes behind a
This
font.
quote by Doyle, he says, learning how to letter, becoming a better letterer, and drawing will make you a better designer, period.
One second, guys. I know I've got to share the screen. There we go.
When you draw, you become a better designer because you're dealing with the same things. You have to deal with this sense of space. So you're dealing with spatial relationships. You're dealing with things, particularly when you're doing, say, for example, a layout. You need a sense of balance and contrast, the way the elements relate to one another. When you're doing a piece of lettering, you have to think in those terms as well. How does each letter relate to one another? Do they work well together? Does one draw too much attention to itself? If you're designing a layout, for example, you have to do the same thing. Maybe you want to emphasize one part of it over another. You need to have an awareness, though, of how those elements exist in that space, how to move them or shape them in order to get the result that you want. And you have to do the same thing within lettering. House Industries is a graphic design studio, digital type foundry, and it started in 1993. It was founded by Andy Cruz and Rich Rote, who were working in an office together and figured that they'd be a lot happier working for themselves. So they started a company called Brand Design in 1993, and they wanted to hire another guy that they were working with, but they couldn't afford to pay him. So they made him a partner. That was Alan Mercer. The digital type scene really started to explode, and House Industries really took off. Lettering can stand on its own as a logo type, something like that. It can also be used as part of a larger design application. So, for example, if you have a layout or something like that, you may use a piece of lettering to enhance other design work. I don't have a formal lettering education, and it was something that I learned much on my own, or I would try to meet folks who did lettering, learn as much as I could from them. It's something that doesn't really exist within contemporary design education, having this kind of sort of master-disciple kind of relationship. That sounds like really kind of strange when you put it that way, but a teacher-student, let's say, a teacher-student relationship. It's something that's I think is really important, and unfortunately, it doesn't exist quite the way that it did before.
All right, we're going to have to stop it there. But if you ever have a chance, check out the House Industries interview with Ken Barber. It's pretty incredible to see all the different fonts that they design and how they go about doing it. But he did touch on spacing, which is important in our layout and design work that we're doing now. So make sure that your fonts are lining up with everything. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. But before we end, I just wanted to remind you about the assignment. You're going to want to submit your PDF for grading. So you're also going to need to make a JPEG of your poster and put it on your Behance portfolio site. So remember, you're beefing that up as well. Email your FPA and CC me with the URLs to the page so it's on your Behance portfolio site. That will get you full credit for this assignment. So copy and paste the URL into the comments when you're submitting as well. When you submit, just where you would enter, wherever you would message me, just include that URL to your Behance portfolio, and I'll check you off on that. And then this is it, you guys. So thanks for coming. Thanks for joining me, and I appreciate you watching from home. Good luck with the assignment. I will be here on Wednesday tomorrow at the same time for our last multi-session. So take advantage of the time and come ask questions, bring your assignments, anything that you're trying to catch up on, and I will see you guys tomorrow.